Started with this event. My name is Rob Albro. I'm the Associate Director of AU Center for Latin American Latino Studies, and accompanying this august group of Cuba experts in this panel-style discussion based on a recent trip that the four of us took to Cuba last December, mid-December. So we're calling this event Magical Thinking Won't Produce Cuba's Final Hour. We also have a blog post along those lines with that title that sort of functions as an accompaniment to this in-person discussion, which I invite you to review or read on our center Outlook blog. So just a quick background and then a few words of what our process will be. So I'll just provide some context, introduce the other three panelists. They will each take a tight 5 minutes to offer some initial thoughts, and we have a sort of method to the madness of what we've done. We've organized, and I'll explain that in a moment. And then I'll take a brief moderator's privilege to ask them some questions that will further allow us to kind of get into this conversation, and then we'll just open it right up for a general discussion with you all. So we're looking forward to that. So we were in Cuba, primarily, exclusively rather, in Havana for a 3-day conference that is an annual event. Now, I think this was the 23rd edition of that conference that these gentlemen have been going to for quite some time, on and off again, organized by the Center for Research and International Policy in Havana. And it tends to focus on different questions related to, obviously, to Cuba and U.S.-Cuba relations. And it was focused this year on sort of Trump administration and Cuba, shockingly enough. But also, and all three of these people presented at that conference. But also, we've over the years used it as an opportunity to touch base with a range of different folks throughout sort of the Cuban policy universe. And this included Cuban and international journalists, AP, Time, New York Times, Guardian, CNN, etc. It includes U.S. diplomats stationed in Cuba. It includes foreign diplomats, and we met with quite a few ambassadors there, including the ambassadors of, in no particular order and inter alia, Mexico, Spain, Colombia, Vietnam, many Scandinavian countries, and the UK and others, leaving a few out. We also met with Cuban officials and some civil society actors in Cuba. And while they're, of course, sort of observing the circumstances of ordinary Cubans living their lives, at least from the vantage point of the capital city of Havana. So the goal was to listen to multiple perspectives and on the current state of affairs in Cuba, and to sort of hear different accounts and put those together to get a sense of what our understanding of U.S.-Cuba relations are at the moment. So what I want to do, given that brief context, is introduce our speakers. First, Phil Brenner here in the middle, Emeritus Professor in AU's School of International Relations. And you might want to expound a little more when it's your turn.
Can I just ask quickly, is the Zoom working? Because the Zoom link was sent out to people, and I'm just wondering.
The Zoom, I think so. Yeah, Kat set it up. Thank you.
Oh, it is. Okay, sorry.
It's happening. It's operating. It's functioning. Doing its thing. So anyway, Phil, thank you though for checking. And then next to me, Bill Leogrand, who is currently the Associate Vice Provost for Academic Affairs at AU and a Professor of Government at the School of Public Affairs. Mm-hmm. And then also on the far end, I should say before I go on to Fulton, Both Phil and Bill have over the years written extensively and done a lot of research on Cuba. So I just brought a few examples, some of those in no particular order. This is a good one that Bill co-edited with Eric Hirschberg on the erstwhile opening and implications. This is a more recent thing by Phil and Bill together with John Kirk on Cuba at the crossroads. Cuba might be at a different crossroads right now, but I think the crossroads metaphor still kind of makes sense. So I invite you to check those out, and also the work, the rest of the work that they've done. And then finally, Fulton Armstrong is a research fellow in AU Center for Latin American and Latino Studies. And I should add about Fulton, since he's a little bit less in the academic trajectory. His distinguished career is as a policy expert and analyst of Latin America and particularly Cuba. He's held a number of high-level positions in the U.S. government, including the Senate Foreign Relations Committee and in the executive branch and elsewhere. So we're very pleased to have Fulton here as well. And of course, Fulton was with us in Cuba, Havana. So what we'll do is give each of the speakers a few minutes to sort of offer some top line thoughts, both about our trip and about how they're seeing things right now. And then I'll ask questions and we'll move into a conversational mode with you all. The way we thought we'd do this is we'd start with Phil, who will describe sort of like what we saw during the most recent visit. And Phil's been there many times, and so he can, of course, compare and contrast last December with previous times that he's been to Cuba. And then we would move on to Fulton, who would address impacts of specifically U.S. policy toward Cuba, including recent policy developments under the second Trump administration. And then we would conclude with Bill and sort of flip the script, asking Bill to think a little bit about Cuban policy as that's developed toward the U.S., but also recent economic monetary policies that we see coming out of the island. And so with that, I'll start with Phil. Take it away.
Rob, thank you very much. Just to say that I've been traveling to Cuba since 1974, and the combined experience, the three of us, that was over 100 years. So we bring some perspective on this. We were there 2 months ago. Things have changed dramatically since then. I'm going to let Fulton describe some of that, but as you probably know, life has gotten to be very difficult. It was difficult when we were there. So let me briefly describe what we saw. The first thing I think we experienced was the resilience of Cubans. The common phrase is resolver. They are trying every which way to figure out how to make do. And at the same time, there's enormous contempt for the Trump administration. They blame the government some, but they also recognize that a lot of their problems come because of US policy. And this is not just the average person we were talking to, but we found among officials. It's not that. Should I start again?
No.
This one's.
If it's not working, just let him use Bill's.
It sounds like.
See if this one's working. Yeah.
This one.
I'll sing.
It's working. Yeah.
Okay. And among diplomats, we saw there's actually very little respect for the U.S. diplomatic mission in Cuba because it's seen as nothing more than a clownish effort to propagandize. The second thing we noticed was, and we prepared for this, was an outbreak of chikungunya and dengue fever. Both are mosquito-borne viruses that were at the time proliferating on the island. We had to get vaccinations to go there, and both are very serious diseases. One of the causes of the proliferation of this is that there's garbage piling up on the street and attracts mosquitoes. And there's garbage piling up the street because there's insufficient fuel to have garbage trucks come around and pick up the garbage. I mean, we saw that in mid-December, the efforts to try to begin to do this in Havana, there were more garbage trucks than there had been previously, but the enormous amount of garbage was really striking. And it's because of the lack of fuel, but it's also because there's the lack of chemicals for fumigation. And so typically Cuba had done a terrific job of fumigating to prevent mosquitoes from proliferating and carrying disease. And that's not been as available because of the sanctions the United States imposed. The third we saw was a lack of vibrancy. Cuba used to be a place full of life, and now streets are empty. People are staying in, maybe because of the chikungunya virus and the dengue, but there's also they're trying to save money, and so they don't go out and do as much. And so the typical vibrancy that you found in the past in Havana was lacking on this trip. The fourth is the inequality. So back in the early 90s, during a period called the Special Period, after the Soviet Union collapsed and Cuba had to reorganize its economy, there was a considerable suffering, but it was shared equally. High officials we knew got as sick as ordinary people. They lacked sufficient vitamin B. Now there's inequality. Not everyone is suffering. Outside high-priced restaurants, you see Mercedes-Benz and BMWs with Cubans who are going to those restaurants. And one of the things that generates is a sense of hopelessness, a sense of that people feel a lack of that there's that in many ways the revolution is almost over. It's not, but people express this to us. Partly it's a frustration with the lack of reforms the government has undertaken, although even when we were there, the government was implementing some reforms. Reforms are very difficult to implement when you have US sanctions. But people don't trust the government as they used to. And that's I think it's a real problem. And there's especially an anger about the lifestyle of the children of the leaders who seem to have doing very well for themselves. And that creates a sense of unfairness. And I think that's something that has to be attended to. And there's finally frustration about the blackouts, the lack of ability to just get to places because there's insufficient gasoline for cars, for taxis, for buses. And so the lack of medications because people had difficulty importing medications. So life was tough and it's gotten even tougher.
Thanks, Phil. Oh.
Thanks. My job is to talk about US policy and what the implications, what the impact of US policy is, some of which Phil has already talked on. The title of this conference and title of our blog tells a lot of my story. And that is, our policy is magical thinking, that doing the same thing that we've been doing for 60 plus years will now magically deliver not just regime collapse, but the emergence of a pro-US democratic capitalist society. And I think that's why we think it's somewhat magical. The policy is right now and has been for years, but it's increasingly sharp, to make the Cuban state fail. The leadership, the institutions, the infrastructure, and lay the groundwork for this magical regime to emerge. We've been doing this for 60 plus years. As you know, we don't really want a humanitarian disaster. We really would prefer just to get rid of the government and have the people not suffer more. But the model has been since the 60s, make the people suffer so that either sympathizers within the government or within the military will rise up and overthrow the government, or that the people themselves will somehow force the government out. But so if we can really do it without causing too much human suffering, the problem is the model doesn't work. It's been proven to not work. You know the main tools. You all know it. If you don't know that we have an embargo in place, you probably are in the wrong place. Here we've done a complete embargo of all trade, except certain categories that the US government, the State Department, has determined that we can sell. Certain foods, certain medicines, certain other small supplies, but some of them are on a case-by-case basis. It's enshrined in a law called the Helms-Burton Law, and it has extraterritorial provisions. And that is, if a Spanish company, Mexican company, Argentine company, Canadian company want to go and do things that we don't like, we will extraterritoriality-wise go and give them sanctions. And now, of course, you know, on oil, there's also sanctions in place as well. Obama did create, President Obama, 2014. We were in Havana the day that it was announced. It was quite exciting. Cubans were in the streets crying with joy that this happened. He did open some windows, but the embargo stayed in place. And the windows he opened were very easily shut by 480, 490, depending on how you count them, regulations that Trump, during Trump 1, put in place. I don't want to put the Democrats necessarily on a pedestal here because Joe Biden kept almost all of those provisions in place during his 4 years. And the only really significant one that he lifted 6 days before he left. That was taking Cuba back off the so-called State Department list of state sponsors of terrorism. And then, of course, 6 days later, it was put back on by Trump too. So we know what we're dealing with here. We're dealing with a bipartisan problem that both parties have really been ineffective in finding a way to promote what's in our US national interest. I think all of us at this table have studied this long enough to say that, yes, indeed, it is in our national interest. And the humanitarian disaster, regime collapse, Haiti type scenario in Cuba is not in the US national interest.
Unfortunately.
This is a joke among us and stuff. So the policy's been there, and we, of course, block their access to the World Bank, to the Inter-American Development Bank, to the IMF. We blank all these things that if they wanted to do these things, they couldn't do it. We also do $25 to $30 million a year in covert operations run by NED, USAID, even though it's been closed, the operations are continuing and all of that. And while they've been pretty feckless, and most of the people that have received what we calculate to be $600 to $700 million over the course of these programs' lives, most of them don't even live in Cuba. They're outside, they're in Miami, they're in Spain, they're in the Czech Republic and all of that. But they have been successful at one very, very important element of US policy, and that is the persistent creation of fake narratives about Cuba. They're the ones that are still out there saying that there are terrorists in Cuba. They're the ones that are saying that there are Chinese and Russian now, apparently we're now accusing them of having Russian spy bases in Cuba. Another one is new narrative in just the last 2 weeks is that senior government officials are negotiating a deal with the United States along the lines of what Delcy Rodriguez is doing in Venezuela. This is fake news. If you really look at it, all of this information is coming out of little offices in the US government and being then spread. But there is a guy who was on Air Force One last night who is still spreading the story that we're having high-level talks. And he said, an agreement is very close. He said, at this moment, it's already a failed state, and they're coming to us to look for a deal. These narratives, there are other ones, I could go through the whole list, that the Cuban doctors and nurses working overseas are like indentured slaves. That's one that the Cubans had launched so-called sonic attacks against us, against our diplomats and spies in Cuba. All of these things, these narratives are the foundation of the policy. And believe it or not, a lot of people don't have the tools to challenge them and stuff. And so one lesson I learned over 30 years in the US government, including many years in the intelligence community, is if you control the narratives, you control the policy. If you don't challenge the narratives, you're not challenging policy, no matter what nice window dressing you want to put on your statements. I'll pick it up then. We have Venezuela, January 3. We have the extraordinary military attack and military rendition of President Nicolas Maduro. The noose is tightening. The noose is tightening rapidly because we now have, and those of us do Cuba, we usually call it an embargo. There are some people who call it a blockade, but technically it hasn't been a blockade until we now have the oil blockade and the oil quarantine and stuff. So we have the noose nice and tight, and now what we're doing is kicking the legs out from under the chair. And the biggest leg is energy. And Phil talked about electricity outages, no gasoline, curtailing all operations in hospitals, schools, agriculture, offices, even the internet supermarkets, because you could be up here and order food for family members in Cuba. Even they have had to stop because they can't deliver the foods anymore. Is all of this bringing Cuba closer to a popular uprising, a military uprising, or a government surrender? I don't think so. It is making life really difficult, but the underlying residual strengths of Cuba have always been present. There is a nationalism among Cubans, even if they're critical of the government, as Phil has said, and we can easily document a lot of criticism of the government and stuff. But if you say to them, do you want Miami to come down here? Do you want Marco Rubio to be the first president of a free and liberated democratic Cuba? Then suddenly all of the Cubanness supersedes all of the complaints about anything that the government had failed to do. Because the government has had failures. They failed, they voted in 2011 for some nice economic reforms, not quite as far as China and Vietnam had done, but they were pretty good, but they haven't completed them. So one of the debates that we have among us is that the government was too slow. At what point do the people blame the Cuban government for the problems? At what point do they blame the US? I think that with the current oil blockade, the blame is now rapidly shifting back over to us, which means that the solution that we're proposing is probably becoming less rather than more attractive to the Cuban people. On the economic reform side, there's a debate among Cuba watchers. There are some who still say, but if Cuba had just done those economic reforms, they wouldn't be where they are today. I would put to you that, yeah, the macro reforms would have helped, agricultural reforms would have helped a little bit here and a little bit there. But I think I could document for you a chronology of how every time Cuba did a reform, we found ways to thwart those reforms. They diversified their import earnings. They do tourism. We've killed Cuban tourism, because putting them on the state sponsors of terrorist list means that if you are a European from a visa waiver country, you know what the Schengen region is, right? You can no longer visit Cuba and enter the United States without a visa, which means you can't do what's called ESTA. That's huge, because the big tourism was from Europe. When they opened up a private sector, the private sector today employs 40% of the economically activity, the employed people and stuff. We did everything we could to thwart the development of a private sector by making dollar transactions increasingly harder and harder for people to send remittances down to invest. So I think we could argue, I said it's a debate, we could argue that every time Cuba has tried to diversify its trade and its trading partners, we've used the tools that we've outlined in the embargo with its extraterritoriality to thwart them. So right now, I think we can say Cuba does not want evolutionary change. Cuba only wants regime collapse, but it doesn't have a vision for how we will get to
US, not Cuba.
I'm sorry, the US, thank you. The US, but we don't have a vision how we would get from point A to point B to point C.
Dude, it's magic.
It's magic.
Thank you, Fulton.
Sorry, I went off.
That's
You have 1 minute.
Bill, you have 1 minute. Go.
You say that, you're gonna need it. So let me start with Cuba's foreign policy response to the current situation, and particularly the escalation of US sanctions that we've seen in the last year, and especially in the last month. So first, Cuba has reiterated its position, which it has held for a very long time, even when Fidel Castro was leading the country as president. Cuba is willing to talk with the United States about any issue the United States wants to talk about, as long as it's a conversation based on mutual respect and with the understanding that Cuba is not going to compromise its national sovereignty, by which they mean they're not going to negotiate about the shape of their political system or their decision to have a socialist economic system. Whether or not there are any talks going on now, or whether there are talks about talking possibly going on, is the $64,000 question. Bolton is convinced there are not. He may be right. Trump keeps saying that there are talks underway. Cuba keeps saying there are not talks underway. It's possible, and this may just be my hope, that the two countries are exchanging preliminary messages, perhaps through an intermediary like Mexico, which has played that role previously, or the Vatican, which played a central role as intermediary in the last two serious negotiations between Cuba and the United States, the one that led to the Obama opening and the one that led to the short-lived Biden policy changes in the last week or two that he was president. Cuba has also been seeking assistance from its friends around the world, particularly Russia and China, in the hopes that international solidarity in the face of this US escalation will lead other countries to provide some assistance to Cuba to help them to get through this extraordinarily difficult time. The problem, of course, and particularly to counter the loss of Venezuelan oil that Fulton talked about. Venezuela was providing some 20% of Cuba's total oil, and Cuba just doesn't have the financial resources to replace that by just going to the world market. And the problem, of course, is that this new national emergency that the president has dictated, threatening sanctions, threatening tariffs against any country that provides oil to Cuba on any basis, is a major deterrent for a small country, small countries that have helped Cuba in the past: Mexico, Brazil, Angola, Algeria, Vietnam, but especially Mexico, which was providing Cuba with almost as much oil as Venezuela was. Domestically, Cuba's response to the Trump sanctions and the deepening economic difficulties, even before the US attack on Venezuela, Cuba changed its law governing foreign direct investment to make it more attractive for foreign investors. While we were there, they floated their currency against the US dollar to try to undercut the black market, because the official rate was about 1/4 of the street black market rate. And that was causing all kinds of economic distortion. So they floated their currency. They partially dollarized the economy by making retail sales legal in dollars. And after the cutoff of Venezuelan oil, they have launched an austerity program to conserve fuel. A 4-day work week in state enterprises. College students engaged in remote instruction rather than in class, gasoline sales in US dollars and rationed, the closing of some tourist hotels because the combination of US sanctions and shortages have led to a dramatic fall in tourism, which was one of the central pillars of the Cuban economy, and cuts in public transportation. And as you've already heard, the situation on the ground is extraordinarily difficult right now. There's garbage in the streets because the garbage trucks don't have the fuel to pick it up on a regular basis. Airlines are canceling their flights to Cuba because Cuba doesn't have the fuel to allow them to be able to refuel and return home. Just yesterday, nickel mining was suspended. Nickel being one of Cuba's larger exports, again, because of no fuel to run the nickel mining operation. There are shortages of food, there are shortages of medicine, the electrical blackouts now in some parts of the country, well, the electricity is out more often than it is on. I would say that this is not a situation that can go on indefinitely. A country can't survive over the long term like this. The Cuban economy is being forced to grind to a halt as a result of these sanctions. And either there will be some sort of a deal between Cuba and the United States that will lead to some alleviation of sanctions, or there's the risk of complete economic collapse and the resulting social unrest, which more than anything else is likely to lead to another migration crisis. There have been 4 migration crises in the past in Cuba, and leading to hundreds of thousands of Cubans coming to the United States. In total, more than 1 million Cubans coming, well, more than 2 million Cubans coming to the United States. Something I assume President Trump, given his policy on migration, would certainly want to avoid. And so you have, as my colleagues have explained, this odd contradiction between a US policy based on destroying the Cuban economy, but not wanting to create chaos on the island for fear of what it might mean for the United States. But thinking that somehow, in fact, the Cuban government will look at the way in which the United States is punishing collectively the Cuban people and will simply surrender Cuba's national sovereignty. I don't think that's going to happen. And that's why we think that this policy of the United States is one based on magical thinking.
Thanks, all 3 of you. So we got a sort of top line account of circumstances for ordinary Cubans right now, US policy priorities, Cuban policy priorities. And I was going to then move to a period of moderator questions and answers. You know what I'm going to do is open it up to a general Q&A, and we can see where we get with that. And if some of those questions aren't asked, we can always ask them. So why don't we just go ahead on the basis of the context we just heard, and if you have questions. Yeah, Marshall.
Yeah, so Professor Leogrand, you mentioned at the end the potential for another immigration crisis. One thing that I feel like differentiates.
Do we need to put this on the question mic with a mic?
Yeah.
Sure, go ahead, Barl.
I have a microphone for the question. Good idea. Well done.
So I think what has me thinking is the fact that now, you know, things are about as hard in Cuba as they've ever been, but it's also harder for Cubans to come to the United States than it's ever been, right? We don't have the wet foot, dry foot policy anymore, or the ability to seek asylum in the United States, like there was under the Biden administration, which a lot of Cubans utilize. So how do you think the fact that we don't have as much of that, like, you know, escape valve, going to change things for Cuba and for Cubans?
So in 1980, Cuban Americans got on small boats and went to Cuba to pick up their relatives. And the United States Coast Guard couldn't stop them. In 1994, Cubans got on anything that would float to come to the United States to escape the special period when the economy was also in terrible shape, arguably as bad or almost as bad or as bad as things are now. So it's true that Cubans can't easily now just go to Nicaragua, march north to the border, and automatically get into the United States, as was the case just a couple of years ago. But when the situation gets bad, they find ways to come.
Bill,
Yeah, one on the immigration front, because we differentiate between failed state, humanitarian disaster. That would be pretext, tell me if you guys agree or not, that for humanitarian disasters, there are ways of having the UN give you an AOK to do a military intervention, a humanitarian military intervention. And there are some people, I think there are a minority among Cuba watchers, who think that that might be even another part of the win-win scenario of how we're going to get to the magical conclusion, that we can't do it like we did in Venezuela, but we could do it that way.
I do think there's a couple of obstacles to that. One is that the United Nations would never agree to that in the Cuban case, I don't think, because it's so obvious the United States is manufacturing the crisis. That's number one. And number two, I don't think Donald Trump wants boots on the ground in Cuba. He didn't want them in Venezuela. I don't think he'll want them in Cuba.
right. Bill, did you want to get in?
No, I agree with.
Okay.
Good afternoon. My name is Daniel Tovado. I'm a graduate student here at SIS. I had a question on the public reaction to the recent, let's say, oil embargo. So you said that the Cubans are blaming the US government more than they are blaming the Cuban government. And I was wondering if there is data on this, or this is just something that you that is based on the previous reactions of the public to other US sanctions. Thank you.
I think that's referring to something that I said. It's based on anecdotal information, based on precedent, but also an idea of understanding, because we've watched Cuban behavior over many years, that it sure makes a lot of sense. But it's anecdotal right now. You're not going to have a poll that's going to come out and certify that for you.
So we're paying attention not only to what we experienced there, but talking to people who are talking to Cubans, families here. And what they're saying is that they are blaming the United States. Whereas in the past, there was criticism of the government. Now it's clear that the cause of the problem is the United States. And so people understand that.
One of the things that had been happening up until quite recently were the so-called pots and pans protests, where you had ordinary Cubans somewhat spontaneously registering their discontent with, what was happening. And I think what we've seen is we haven't seen any of those recently.
So I think the irony in this is that a lot of Cubans had begun to feel like the government's constantly invoking the US embargo as the cause of their economic problems was like, the boy who cried wolf, and it was just wearing out its efficacy. And partly that's because the Cuban government itself has made a number of policy errors in recent years, has not carried through fully on the economic reform program that Raul Castro put on the table in 2011, a long time ago now. And so I think there was a growing sense in Cuba that this was the government's fault. And the irony of this imposition of sanctions is it's so obvious, and it has such an immediate effect on people's everyday life, that it has revived the argument and increased people's conclusion that this crisis actually is the United States behind it.
There's just one quick thing. One of the major parts of our regime change programs that we put these $25 to $30 million is social media projection onto the island. And our social media projection is vastly faster and sexier and more get out and make noise than anything that the Cuban government puts in front of young people. So the mere art form of message of discontent has really surpassed the government's ability to control. Now, though, I think our thesis is that that's swinging back because it's so clearly now our fault.
The other thing I would point to is Rob is correct in saying these demonstrations were somewhat spontaneous and haphazard. There is no organized opposition in Cuba that would be effective in bringing about a different regime. And so the hope that might arise, recall in Venezuela, there was an election and the population voted for the opposition. There's no organized opposition in Cuba. Those demonstrations happen and they disappear. And in fact, the leaders of some of those demonstrations are gone. They were operating from other countries, and some of the leaders have left anyway. And so there is really not a kind of alternative that the United States is hoping for.
Other questions? Yes.
Hi, my name is Kim. I'm a PhD student at SIS. And thank you guys all for your commentary. It was super fascinating. So I kind of have a question directed at Fulton Armstrong and in the middle, kind of William Leo Grant, if you don't mind. So you had argued Dr. Armstrong, you had argued that that hold on a second, that you don't anticipate that there would necessarily be like a popular uprising. That's what you guys have been saying this whole discussion. And then also, William Leogran, you argued that that a compromise that, how do I say this? Like a compromise that would compromise on Cuba's sovereignty would not necessarily be possible either. How do you reconcile those two? So then what is the solution, right? Is there a middle ground between a complete regime change and something that aligns more with like the US vision, or something that the US would allow to go forward without necessarily changing the entire regime? And then a follow-up question to that is there any hope for Cuba to kind of like bypass its dependence on US? And I know how you guys had mentioned how like the whole oil embargo prevents like Mexico from sending oil to Cuba, but is there a way that Cuba could perhaps rely on other countries and circumvent US dependence? Or is the US just too powerful in this situation? Okay, thank you so much.
I'm gonna add a question that we were going to
I might
pose.
forget the second one, but go ahead.
Add a question we were gonna pose anyway, which is, you know, in that context of what she was sketching out, what are the possibilities of changing US policy toward Cuba?
Okay. The first thing, the dependence on the United States, they showed during normalization that their vast preference would be to have a more normal relationship with the United States. And you could see they didn't let their relationship with Russia and China atrophy, because there are historic links there and stuff, but they clearly wanted to do that. I think the problem with them finding alternatives, other countries to trade with and quote, be dependent on, no one wants them to be a dependency. China is not going to be their sugar daddy. Russia's tied up in a whole bunch of different stuff. But even when they did, for example, they were developing a biotech industry. They were developing these medical brigades. We then in Latin America, in Brazil, in Argentina, we would chase around like with a hammer looking for cockroaches to go and stop every one of those deals that we possibly could. We're going around now country to country to country to shut down the doctor deals and stuff. So if one step would be for the US to stop being so aggressive with our extraterritorial implementation of our embargo. But their preference is to have a relationship with us. I personally believe that they would prefer us over anybody else in the whole wide world. The first one, the contradiction between their not popular uprising, the problem is we can't connect the dots. And I would even argue, to be the controversial, provocative one on this panel, that the idea before was that it was government repression that kept people in their place. But those of us that have been watching it a lot, at least within the government, have always seen that one of the greatest drivers of non-change in Cuba has been their nationalism and their distrust of the United States of America, about which most Americans are ignorant. We don't know the history of the Platt Amendment. We don't know the history of what we did from 1902 until 1959. And that even though they want to trade with us, they don't trust us. And then the third, your point was?
How to change US policy.
One of the bizarre things about Cuba policy is, and I believe it explains why the economists continue to beat the Cuban government about the years all the time on their lack of economic changes, has been that they believe US policy is immutable. We have this constituency, this very strong constituency. We've empowered them. We give them a budget. When you add the regime change money plus the radio TV Marti money of $70 million or more a year, these become an industry that become pretty unstoppable. And I think that most people think that changing Cuba policy is easier than however ironic this is, changing Cuba policy is easier than changing US policy.
So
go ahead, Bill.
they use the term dependence. So I want to make clear that Cuba was not dependent on the United States. Cuba was, until 1959, dependent on the United States, but it wasn't dependent on the United States recently. But, the United States, it was blocked by the United States over these years. So that, if that's what you mean, yes, it was blocked, but it wasn't dependent. And in fact, it stopped being dependent on other countries. One of the goals of the revolution was to diversify its dependency, so it didn't, in fact, replicate. You wanna?
Yeah, like a follow-up then. If it's not so dependent, then why does US policy like dictating and embargoing certain
Because
products?
it's extraterritorial. Because it's extraterritorial, it controls what other countries do. So, for example, the state sponsors of terrorism list. 95% of international transactions go through US banks. Remarkably, if you're trading between Turkey and France, it goes through New York. Under the state sanctions of terrorism list, if you're on that list, you deal with a terrorist country, you get sanctioned. Even at the point when this was relaxed, banks were afraid to deal with Cuba because they were afraid that they would be they would be fined for dealing with terrorism. So it makes it very difficult for countries to trade with Cuba, and makes it very expensive for Cuba to trade with other countries. So it's the extraterritoriality of US policy that affects Cuba. It's not that Cuba is dependent on the United States.
So, good questions. Is there a middle ground? Well, there has been in Venezuela. In other words, the Chavista regime, structurally speaking, is still very much in place. We just decapitated it and then seized their oil industry. But that was enough for Donald Trump. He doesn't seem particularly interested in pursuing democracy in Venezuela, as you can see by the fact that he accepted Maria Corina Machado's Nobel Prize, but he didn't actually let her go back to Venezuela. So the Trump policy in Venezuela is very much a sort of resource-driven policy. The president made it very clear he wanted Venezuelan oil. And now that he's got it, he seems perfectly happy with the government in Venezuela. Now, Cuba doesn't have oil, of course. It does have strategic minerals. It does have good relationship with Russia and China, which if a reconciliation with the United States could keep those relationships from becoming more focused on military and intelligence issues, that would be of value to the United States. And of course, it's got tourism, which the president has spent his business life developing. He sent representatives to Cuba before he was president to see if he could get in on hotels and a golf course.
Get his name up there.
Get his name on a hotel there, the Trump Tower. So I would imagine that for the president, there may be a middle ground in a relationship with Cuba. I don't think that's true for the Secretary of State, however, who's made his political career calling for a regime change and the overthrow of the Cuban government. So who prevails in this situation? Well, the president will probably prevail for two reasons. Number one, he's the president. Number two, Marco Rubio may be gone as Secretary of State a year from now if he wants to run for president, because he can't run for president from Foggy Bottom. Second question about dependence. I'm going to disagree a little bit with Phil on this. He's right about the extraterritorial quality of US sanctions and the way in which we block other countries from having closer economic relations with Cuba. But there are two areas where Cuba has not been able to escape dependence on the United States. One is remittances. There have basically been three pillars in the last several decades, three pillars of the Cuban economy: remittances, tourism, and the third one. The medical services, right, of course. So we're now blocking medical services, as Phil was saying. But remittances, 90% of which come from the United States, that peaked around before COVID at about $4 billion a year. And tourism was about $3 billion a year before COVID. And between 20 and 25% of that came from the United States. I think it's very hard for any country in the Caribbean, particularly small countries, to avoid economic dependence on the United States. Because the gravitational pull of the US economy is so enormous. And you can see that even for a country like Canada, it's dependent enough on trade with the United States, just trade, that it's vulnerable to the United States using sanctions to punish it. And the Canadian Prime Minister gave an eloquent speech not so long ago about how countries like the middle countries, let alone the small countries, need to recalibrate their international relations to guard themselves against that kind of dependence. And finally, how to change US policy. Vote. Vote. That's the only way you're going to change
As many times as you can.
But we voted for Joe
completely fine.
Biden perhaps, and Joe Biden didn't change it.
Vote
We have to,
anyway.
I think we have to change the narratives. We have to demand honesty, transparency of our leadership class. We have to stop silliness that we're doing, right? You'd agree with those too, right?
Sure. And give money to your favorite candidates.
But you might have given money to Joe Biden, and Joe Biden didn't do anything.
Ernesto, go ahead.
Thank you. Thank you so much for doing this. Sorry I'm late. I was in a panel myself and the transportation time. But a basic question for you guys, but help me think about it. Something different between Cuba and Venezuela, I think, is that at the end of the missile crisis, there was this promise by the US governments that we would never invade Cuba, right? How much do you think that's still a red line for the Trump-Rubio administration? Or do you think there could be a scenario where we could go to another Bay of Pigs type of a scenario?
So, thank you. Ernesto Castañeda is the director of the Center for Latin American and Latino Studies. Thank you for sponsoring this forum. So the promise that Kennedy made was sort of with his fingers crossed. There were provisos that said it depended on Cuba not being a threat anymore to the United States. Kissinger reinterpreted that actually to make it even stronger to say that the United States would not invade Cuba, but that was a promise. There was nothing guaranteed about that. And as Fulton well described, there are instances after instance where we've essentially attacked Cuba by supporting subversive activities. So I don't think that matters. But let me point out that with respect to the Venezuelan example that Bill brought up, I'll disagree with him a little bit and say that I think that Marco Rubio is open to persuasion. There was a report by Bloomberg yesterday, day before, where Marco Rubio said that what would be sufficient would be economic change in Cuba, opening up to US corporations. Well, Cuba's willing to do that. Cuba has already changed its laws to allow US corporations to come in if there's no embargo. I mean, it's a US law that stops them, but Cuba is quite willing to allow investment by foreign companies. And so, in fact, they could do things that call it a victory and announce that Cuba has succumbed to the pressure of the United States and is now open, and the United States will make a deal on cobalt, which is one of the Cuba's minerals that they have, and maybe nickel. Nickel is also a key ingredient in, for example, stainless steel. And so there are medicines that are available. Cuba has developed, for example, a drug that prevents people who have diabetes from being amputated. This is now in trials by the FDA, in third stage trials, which makes them almost ready to be marketed. 60,000 Americans every year have limbs amputated because of diabetes. Imagine what a gift that would be. So I think there are things Cuba can provide very readily, and the United States could call it a victory. And I think Marco Rubio might be willing to accept that.
Go ahead.
Just one follow up on the middle way or halfway or whatever, middle ground. We already did a really good experiment with Cuba called normalization in 2014 and 2017. And even though the US kept the embargo fully in place, except breaking a couple of little windows for Americans to travel, a couple little windows to expand remittances, a couple little windows to do this, even though the embargo structurally and all of the extraterritoriality stayed in place, the Cubans played with us. It went quite well. So there is a way out of this, but I think at this point, we're the ones that are tightening the noose, and it's going to have to be from here. The Venezuela model doesn't work. Venezuela is not Cuba, and Cuba is not Venezuela. And I don't think that any self-respecting government is going to allow a system where the foreign country comes in, takes over your complete oil industry, and then writes you a check every week or two with your part of the profits. That's just not going to happen in Cuba.
So on the missile crisis, of course, we made the promise to the Soviet Union, and they don't exist anymore. I think the deterrent for putting boots on the ground in Cuba is Trump's base. It's the America First movement. It's his promise, no more endless foreign wars, no more democracy promotion, right? It's what's in it for the United States is the only thing that counts. And so and we have seen his base, not all of it obviously, but we've seen criticism and resistance from his base over the attack on Iran's nuclear potential, over the attack on the supposed drug boats in the Caribbean, over the abduction of the president of Venezuela, and over this, and even over this embargo or oil blockade, more properly called. Yeah. So I think he doesn't want to get involved in that. Plus, if you invade another country, I mean, full-scale invade another country, you're not going to get the Nobel Peace Prize.
Even if you already have someone else's.
Even if you have somebody, you not get your own.
Are there other questions? Marcy.
Okay. So, among many of the issues that have been named, I think the inability to travel to Cuba makes it hard for many generations of people to be defenders or people who speak out. I mean, years back under Obama, we had alternative breaks going to Cuba from American University, or we had AU abroad in Cuba. And I just feel like we've lost the opportunity for people who were willing to speak out and organize, in addition to voting, to say, this is a country we've learned from and we want to get to know. So that's one point I want to make. The medical stuff, I was just in Honduras and was in a rural community where Cuban doctors had done 25,000 cataract surgeries, but they just voted in a right-wing president, and chances are they're going to get kicked out. So I feel like, there's so much important medical stuff that has happened that, some of us have seen or heard about, and it's just getting harder. As one example, Ernesto and I are doing a collection of medical supplies right now to send to Cuba, and we're working with the Center for Cuban Studies and a few other people. But the trouble is with these flights, how are we going to send it down? I mean, I'm very curious about the fight and the refueling thing, because we also were just in Miami and saw a whole lineup of American Airlines flights going to Cuba. And I don't understand, do they really go and then refuel somewhere else? Or is it just not been enforced yet, that new policy?
No,
So
We're enough, they can go round trip without
they
refueling.
have enough fuel to go around.
Okay, so it's not that it's illegal for them to go, as long as they can do that on their own, it's acceptable. So there might be ways to get it down there.
Canadian flights. They don't have.
Canadian flights can. Okay, anyway, that was, my main points or questions, if anybody wants to comment on any of that. And the other thing that I'm concerned about is the Cuban interest section. Is there a threat?
Embassy.
It's embassy. It's not called the interest section anymore here?
It's an embassy.
Oh, it is a Cuban embassy. Great. So is that threatened? Because I understood that the Venezuelan one was shut down, right?
Years ago.
That was years ago.
Yeah.
Okay, so but the Cuban embassy is fine and stable and everything.
In fact, there's several people from the Cuban embassy here today.
I thought so.
That's right.
Do you feel secure and stable?
Good.
So in answering Marcy's various questions, maybe put this in the context of the more general question of what can Cuba and Cuban policymakers do in the context of the ongoing US pressure and embargo to address their energy crisis, economic crisis.
What can Cuba do?
What can Cuba do? Yeah.
I want to start with the people can't travel question because that's easier.
They're connected.
Of course, we can still travel to Cuba as long as the flights are going. It is still legal to travel to Cuba. There are still groups. You can't go as an individual by yourself as a tourist. You can't do that. But there are lots of groups still sponsoring trips to Cuba, and it is legal. So if people want to go to Cuba, it still is possible to do that. Be clear about that.
I mean,
Be clear also
Remind
that
me-
you sign a document that says you're going there to help the Cuban people become independent of their government, and you can't stay in government hotels, you can't eat in government restaurants, etc.
There are lots of
Right.
restrictions.
And from the US side, there are the 12 categories?
12 categories of travel.
Yeah.
The one that Fulton is describing is the support for the Cuban people
Right.
category, right? But
Which is the one that groups go on.
which is the one that groups go. But the group that sponsors and organizes your trip will take care of all the things to make sure that you don't break any of the rules, right? So you don't have to hire your own lawyer in order to do it. So what can Cuba do? I mean, and pretty much what I was saying. They can appeal to their friends. They can appeal to the humanitarian goodwill of the world community to provide them with enough assistance, either in terms of oil or in terms of food or in terms of any of the other things they can't buy on the world market right now because of the shortage of hard currency, to get them through this in the hope that US policy will at least begin to change as the US government changes. So it's a year, 3 years, I don't know. But they're doing the things domestically, I think, that they can do in terms of austerity. It's not a time when Cuba can really undertake dramatic internal economic reforms when it can't keep the lights on, right? I mean, the kinds of things that it could and should do in terms of macroeconomic stabilization and sort of getting prices right and reforming its domestic economy all cost money. Most countries, when they go through this kind of a macroeconomic stabilization process, they have the support of the World Bank, they have the support of the International Monetary Fund, and often they have the support of larger developed countries. Cuba has none of that, none of it. And so to expect, dramatic reforms, and I think Fulton was saying this earlier, to expect dramatic reforms when they don't have any safety net and the United States is doing whatever it can to make life harder for them, it's just not a reasonable expectation.
So one of the common comparisons is to Vietnam. And it says, why doesn't Cuba do what Vietnam did? Well, there are several reasons for that. One is when Vietnam changed its economic system in 1986, Vietnam was 75% rural and 25% urban. Cuba is 75% urban and 25% rural. It means that Vietnam was able to feed itself, even though we had destroyed a lot of rice land with Agent Orange, it was still able to feed itself. Cuba has trouble feeding itself. Getting food from rural areas to the city requires oil, gasoline, diesel to transport. So Cuba imports a lot of its food. It's been a problem for Cuba for a long time. It should have reformed its agricultural system. There's no question about that. I think there's general agreement about that. But at this point, it becomes very difficult for Cuba to do the way Vietnam did. And Vietnam did not have a United States. It had US an embargo but it didn't have an extraterritorial embargo against Vietnam. So Vietnam was actually able to reach out to other countries in the Southeast Asian area and begin to have alliances that Cuba has been unable to do. Let me say something about medical professionals, for example, which was a terrific thing that Cuba did. It's, as Fulton said, the United States claimed that these people were indentured servants. And the reason is because part of their salary gets taken by the Cuban government. But you know, if any professional would work for a corporation, a lawyer going to Brazil, for example, that law firm would take most of the earnings that the lawyer would generate, and the lawyer would get a part of that. This is what happens with Cuban doctors. Cuban doctors get a portion in hard currency of the earnings that they generate. And the Cuban government gets the rest that uses for things like importing food or importing oil. But Cuba also donates services, doctor services, to countries that can't afford it. When the Haitian earthquake hit in 2010, there were 400 Cuban doctors already in Cuba servicing poor people in Haiti. The United States wouldn't allow the US support going into Haiti to be used by the Cuban doctors who were helping the Haitian people.
The guest workers from South Asia would love to have the deal that the Cuban doctors have, and so would their wife and children back home, because a chunk of the money does go back to them. On what can they do? They do have some band-aids, but they will have to move toward an autarkic type of economic system. The band-aids are, they do produce 35, 40% of their own petroleum and stuff, but distributing it is going to be very difficult. On the diplomatic side, you can see they're saying US will talk about anything. And it's true, because we then hammer them and we give them lists of demands. Well, just release political prisoners. They released hundreds of political prisoners in the last weeks of Biden. And what did they get? They got nothing but in fact, they got the state sponsors list restored. So I think that basically the ball's in our court to either call their bluff, because heaven forbid we trust them, call their bluff, but to engage. And if they are exchanging notes, because we routinely exchange notes about flights, you know how many American commercial flights fly over that island? The FAA is in constant communication, Coast Guard's in constant communication. There's a lot of communications going on, but those channels have not reached, as President Trump said last night, that we are reaching an agreement with the highest levels of the Cuban government, which means we're not talking about pre-talks. He's saying that we're already negotiating essentially their surrender, apparently because he calls it a failed state. So they have to up their game on the diplomatic side. They need to build their strength with Lula, who's been missing in action, with Claudia, who succumbed to our pressure to not send oil, with the others in Western Europe who suffer from the extraterritoriality just as everybody else does. So they can do some more, but ultimately the question is this debate between Marco Rubio and Donald Trump. And I think of these two gentlemen who said they disagreed with each other, I'm going to go with Marco Rubio as being the guy that's running this policy.
You know, our ambassador equivalent in Cuba's name is actually Hammer, just to be clear. Yes.
So I have a comment asking for your response, which is a bit provocative, but I want to argue that the Trump policy is working, that it is, and I think the question really comes down to whether you think the goal is regime change or just to make Cuba bleed and to suffer and to make sure that the Cuba model doesn't work. And so I'm going to go with the point has always been to make sure the Cuban model doesn't work. And so, and that fits with both Rubio and Trump in the sense that they want the liberal international order to end and to have a world of autocracies. And so I would like your response to my comment that the policy as it is now is working.
If it's to make the state fail and the Cuban people suffer?
Correct.
without thinking about the magical conclusions. But they have to be careful because I think all of us would agree that a real true humanitarian disaster would be a disaster for the US as well. No?
Yeah, no, yeah. So Betsy, Professor Cohen, yes, I think the policy is working to make people suffer in Cuba. There's no question that policy is working. But what the goal of the policy is what is in dispute. And so I think Fulton laid out very well, there were two alternatives. One is you hope that by making people so miserable, they will rise up against their own government. That has never worked.
And it's not going.
Historically, that is not how revolutions occur. And the second possibility is that someone in the Cuban leadership, I mean, as we understand it from our conversations, the State Department believes that someone in the Cuban leadership will stand up and say, enough of this, we want a capitalist democracy, and everyone will follow magic.
Now, they're not clear who that would be exactly, or.
They claim
They
they're
don't
trying to
know
find
that-
someone like that.
I'm
And there is-
suggesting a
and-
third way.
They don't have a third way. So I think that they're looking for a way out because they're worried actually about a humanitarian disaster. And I think Trump, when he wakes up part of the day, he might recognize that. The question is who he listens to last. And, you know, if he listens to Rubio, Rubio might be lying to him, and Rubio might still believe there's someone who will do that. But I think Rubio is coming around to realizing they're not getting what they want. And the danger is a humanitarian disaster.
I have no idea what these guys think. I mean, really, I mean, we're academics, right? We're used to sort of thinking using sort of rational actor models, right? And it's not at all clear. Now, Marco Rubio is a very smart guy. You should not underestimate Marco Rubio. Donald Trump acts on instinct or self-interest for sure, but not on sort of long-term thinking about the strategic interests of the United States. So I don't know what Donald Trump really wants. I know what Marco Rubio wants. And I think Marco Rubio is the architect of the policy. But if it dawns on Donald Trump that Marco Rubio's policy is leading him down a bad path, then Marco Rubio is going to end up like John Bolton, who was the architect of the failed Venezuela policy in Trump's first administration. That is to say, you know, out looking for a job. Maybe the president.
We're going to jail.
Yeah, I was saying.
Well, so it's yes, I agree with Phil. The goal is to make life as hard as possible for the Cuban people, but I don't think it just stops there, right? I think the dream of regime change is still alive and well in the heart of Marco Rubio and, you know, all of his friends in South Florida. But they may be about the only ones who really see that as the ultimate, as their ultimate goal. I think, you know, there's a lot of other people in this country who, if they ever think about Cuba, think about it more in terms of opportunity. And there's some people in the Cuban American community who think about it that way as well.
I mean, Trump has two choices. Trump wants a legacy, and he wants to be the president who did something that no one else could do. So that could be overthrowing the regime. The other thing could be, just to play with the idea, he comes in, NAFTA's the worst trade agreement in the whole wide world. He negotiates NAFTA 2, gives it a new name. It's almost the same thing. And he calls it a victory and says, this is the best trade accord we've ever had. So is there a way for him to be convinced, because the consequences of the disaster are truly disastrous for him as well, his political thing, could he be convinced, no, why don't you do something more modest? And that is normalization 2, but call it something else.
You know, I agree with you, Fulton, just very quickly, that about Trump to some extent, but I think the one other element of it is asset accumulation, you know, he sees getting assets as a mode of fame and of you know, expanding his footprint on planet Earth.
Oh, yeah.
And, you know, the problem, of course, so Venezuelan oil. So what is the Venezuelan oil equivalent in Cuba? Much less clear what that might be beyond hotels with names on it, and things of this nature. So it does, like, as you were suggesting, leave things in a place of who the hell knows what Trump is thinking. Whereas with Rubio, it's quite clear, you know, what his agenda is, right? So someone else, yes, I'm sorry, go ahead.
So I have a question about the current state of migration from Cuba, but specifically knowing that Cuba has supported the Polisario Front the past years symbolically in military.
Speak a little louder.
Yes, there has been direct ties between Cuba and the Tindouf camp, which is the Polisario Front camp in the Sahara. So I was wondering if that was playing a role in a route towards Canary Island or just throughout the Sahara getting in Spain. And knowing the recent US implication in the Sahara matter, I was wondering if that played a role in kind of impacting that migratory flow for routes towards Spain or Europe for Cubans.
All right, that's a good question.
Migration from North Africa to the Canaries, did you say?
Yeah, not North Africa, but Polisario Front.
Oh, sorry.
So the Sahara
Yeah,
directly,
correct.
they go to the Sahara and then they go to Canary Islands.
Valley, yeah. I don't know that we have that, yeah. I don't know that we have, I mean, you know, we can speak a little bit more, and Ernesto, you could probably also add to this about what has been happening to Cubans leaving Cuba in this hemisphere, and then what that has looked like for them as they've been invited to leave the United States. But I don't know about the other. What, maybe you can expand on your question a little bit in the sense that what would be your concern?
So Trump recently considered the Western Sahara as fully Moroccan, so under Moroccan sovereignty. So that definitely has an impact on the Polisario Front and their activities within the Sahara. And since there was like direct ties between Cuba and Polisario Front, there has been like they've been using routes towards the Sahara to Spain and Canary Islands. So that was kind of like an escape for Cubans to migrate to Europe. And since now with what happened recently, I was wondering if there is kind of an implication on the migratory flows. Like, are Cubans still have a way to go to Spain, or
Got it. Good.
or not anymore?
All right, good question. Ernesto, why don't you take a crack at it?
No, actually, the Polisario and Cuba relationship, I don't know anything. I don't know how big it is. Obviously, as a concern in Morocco, I don't think it's a big part of the US discussion. And a lot of people in Cuba are able to get to Spain is a big destination for Cubans now and before. Remittances are also not as big as the US, but also coming from there. Yeah, but no, I'm not exactly sure, Sinef. Yeah, sorry about that.
So do you know the scale of that? Do you have any sense of how many Cubans were using this route to get?
No, I do not know. I just know that was like a route that was used by Cubans to get like to Spain. It was from the Canary Islands, and because of how close it is to the Sahara, using kind of the Polisario kind of tie to have access to Spain. And also, because of kind of the migratory policies that Spain has.
I have no idea.
So can I say, you know what's going on with Nicaragua?
They shut it down.
They shut it, Nicaragua shut it
So
down.
Nicaragua, I mean, I don't know, this might be a model for others, which is Nicaragua was a major transport site for Cubans to come to the United States. And the Nicaraguans just let it happen because they were making money off of it. They just shut it down as a way to curry favor with the Trump administration. Hoping
the other
that'll
problem-
make a difference.
Yeah, I mean, the other problem, of course, is now the southern border is so well sealed by the United States that the number of Cubans coming across the southern border, you can count on two hands.
Small.
It's very, very, very small.
So we're coming to the end of our hour and a half, but I wanted to invite all three of you to maybe offer your last comment.
Well, I would pick up on something Marcy said, and I think that we can all provide personal support to several different organizations that are providing, at the moment, humanitarian aid to Cuba. And perhaps we could even put that information on the CLS, the class website, so people know where they can provide personal, I mean, $5, $10. Students don't have a lot of money, but skip a coffee and send $5. One of the things it does is it shows how large the population in the United States is that's willing to help Cuba. And so I think that you don't only have to vote, you can vote with your pocketbook.
Even in the so-called good old days, which really weren't all that good before the special period in peacetime and things, analysts, US government intelligence analysts would go and do briefings downtown, and the economists would always have these very judgmental judgments, these very judgmental assessments about how bad the Cuban economy was, even in the good old days, how bad it was and how feckless they are and how disorganized they are, how far away they are from orthodoxy and all of that. And they were usually booed and hissed even by Republican recipients of their briefings, because they say, you're telling me that it's a dog that walks on its hind legs, but you're not explaining to me how it's walking on its hind legs. But it has always been a dog walking on its hind legs. And I would remind you that every photo, every bit of footage that you see of Cuba, you'll see a 1957, 58, or 59 Chevrolet chugging around with a big black cloud of smoke behind it, and holes in the floor and stuff like that. And you'll say, how is that old car chugging down the street? Well, they don't have fuel right now, but that ingenuity, that resolver, as Phil said earlier, that culture is there. They've been practicing for this sort of showdown for a long, long, long time. We can't predict the outcome, but I don't think that everybody in Cuba is entirely surprised that this is where they are today.
No.
So for the first half of the 20th century, the United States had the kind of dominion over Cuba that Marco Rubio and Donald Trump appeared to want to restore. And it generated so much animosity among Cubans who wanted their own sovereign country that it led to a revolution in 1959. And now we've been antagonists ever since. So I hope one way or another that the United States doesn't just make that same mistake over again.
Before we give some well-deserved applause to our panelists, just one more question, which we're going to very briefly address.
Okay.
Very briefly. Yeah.
Ernesto Godoy. Besides the commercial airlines doing business with Cuba, do you know any other, or the percentage of other businesses, US businesses with license doing with businesses?
Yeah.
Last
in
year,
Cuba?
the US companies sold about $500 million worth of agricultural supplies, food mainly, but agricultural implements. There's a range of companies that have done this. And in fact, in the last 2 months, that level of sales has gone down only slightly, despite the fact that Cuba doesn't have a hard currency. So yes, it's not just the airlines that are.
All right, we're going to use that as a note to end, and I'd like to ask applause for our panelists. And discussion, guys. What?
Yes, go.
I have to talk to Marcy.
Oh, yeah. I didn't know they were doing that.
If she's having a hard time Google.
Well, I owe you an apology because you stayed almost the time,
And I went 10 minutes.
both blew it all out of the water, you had to give up and repeat that after that.
You know, I basically, what I would have used the extra time for was to describe more what's happening.
With the,
No, we got around.
Secret Church? Yeah, how are you?
But anyway, thank you both.
Are you?
Really good.
I think it's a shepherd.
Yeah, I agree.
Someone involved with this, okay.
To be available.
So does he
Well,
still have the recipient set up?
Yes.
There are different.
No, I mean,
we have,
seven.
yeah, like, we have a YouTube channel. Did make.
So if I look at
Uh,
my.
Yeah, you can't find it.
Like you said,
Yeah,
no?
it's just a link.
This would be great, yeah, because I've been looking at options, but I don't know.
The university also has its YouTube channel that.
Yeah.
That's just the asking questions.
You're welcome.
Yeah.
I'm gonna count them. Oh.
I still can supervise.
Oh, okay, well, I work on the, I work in the Middle East, my name. Like, when you're not, and I don't know anything other than SIS, so it's like, oh.
No, I was there.
Did you supervise off?
Oh, it's fair.
I'm one of the.
Oh, nice. So I'm just gonna, maybe I don't know, but anyway, I just wanted to make the connection.
Good. What area?
I'm in my second year. I'm still taking classes. So, yeah.